Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm David French with Curtis Chang, and we're recording this podcast on Good Friday. So a lot of listeners, you'll get this on Saturday, and many listeners also listen to this on Sunday if you listen on Easter Sunday. If you are, happy Easter. And we're going to talk a little bit about Easter and talk a little bit about this moment and its meaning towards the end of the podcast. But this is not going to be overall an Easter-themed podcast. It's going to be different. The title is Why Christians Should Defend Democracy, which sounds a little, what? Why would we need to talk about that? What's going on? And why we need to talk about that is, I think there's a couple of interesting reasons that we're going to get to in a minute. But Curtis, let's just first sort of define our terms, okay? So when we say why Christians should defend democracy, what exactly are we talking about?
Right. We're going to be using democracy as a shorthand here for a particular form of governance known as liberal democracy. Now, when we say liberal democracy, we're not using the term liberal in the contemporary political sense of liberal versus conservative. It's the older classical definition of liberal, which is really liberating from kind of the history of monarchy and absolutism, right? That's what liberal democracy is. And liberal democracy is really this set of institutional norms. It's a collection of institutional norms like the rule of law, balance of powers in the government, free and fair elections, civil rights, human rights, individual rights, and I can go on. But this set of institutional norms that we basically have taken for granted now in America, it borrows from ancient Greek democracy, but it really took its modern form in the 17th, 18th century. It became embodied in England probably first, and then it really established itself in the United States, and then really spread out, in the founding of the United States, and then spread outward there, especially in the countries that we collectively call the West. And the thing about liberal democracy, or democracy I'm going to use as a shorthand, to really understand is it's just an abstraction that really becomes real only in the form of democratic institutions. Right? Democracy is only made real when it's embodied in things like a fairly elected legislature, an executive that operates under the rule of law, a judicial body that enacts its rulings in fairness and transparency, and a military that submits to civilian rule, and you can go on. Election agencies that guarantee free and fair elections. You could throw a free press in there. Right, so all of these institutions working together under these kind of norms, that's what constitutes what we're calling democracy or liberal democracy. And just one final caveat here, when we say we're making the case why Christians should care about and defend this thing that we're calling democracy, let's just be upfront. We're not saying that Christianity and democracy are the same thing.
Right.
They're not.
Right.
Democracy is not the only form of Christian, government that's compatible with Christianity. It's obviously not found in the Bible. It's a human invention, and Christians have thrived. In fact, thrived brilliantly before democracy, and they'll thrive outside of democracy. So, we're not saying democracy is Christian in the sense of those two ought to be equated. We're also not saying that our current version of democratic institutions are perfect. Yet, I think, David, we are saying there are still really good reasons why Christians should support and defend democracy and democratic institutions.
Right. Reasons consistent with Christian theology.
That's
reasons
right.
that reflect sort of an understanding of humanity that we pull and we gain from Scripture. But I'm glad you added that caveat. I mean, look, the New Testament, for example, is pretty silent on the separation of powers doctrine.
That's right. Not much in there about that.
It's very silent about representative democracies and the benefits of our congressional system versus a parliamentary democracy.
That's right.
And yeah, but one of the things I think a good short definition is actually of what liberalism is, or a liberal democracy is, actually comes from one of its Christian critics, a guy named Patrick Deneen, who's a Catholic intellectual out at Notre Dame. And he talks about liberalism as a form of government that, quote, conceives of humans as rights-bearing individuals who could fashion and pursue for themselves their own version of the good life. Opportunities for liberty under this system are best afforded by a limited government devoted to securing rights, along with a free market economic system that gave space for individual initiative and ambition. That's a kind of a shorthand version of liberalism that I think is a shorthand definition that I think is pretty decent. Yeah. And I think it's important now to talk about why would we be raising this in a podcast? I mean, isn't this sort of like, especially if you're American Christians and you're listening to this, isn't this kind of part of the air that we breathe and the water that we swim in? I mean, isn't sort of an of course? I mean, of course. And the answer to that is actually this very concept of liberal democracy is under both military attack abroad,
yes, clearly,
and clearly an intellectual attack here at home.
That's right.
And so the military attack abroad is actually something that I've written about in one of my Sunday newsletters. It is the assault of a version of Christendom, literally an assault of a version of Christendom on a imperfect country, Ukraine, that is striving towards liberal democracy. And when I talk about a version of Christendom, quite literally, Vladimir Putin has tried to integrate the Russian Orthodox Church within the Russian state. There is actually a Russian Orthodox parish in the FSB building, and the FSB is the sort of new version of the old KGB. So you have integration of the Russian Orthodox Church with the state. Sort of when Putin speaks, for example, of his war in Ukraine, he speaks about it in very explicit religious terms. And frankly, one of the reasons why at least some people on the American right liked Vladimir Putin was for that very integration, in the way in which he was integrating Russian Orthodox morality into the Russian state. Now, the irony here is, as with the irony that often exists in the face of when people strive to create Christendom, and when I talk about Christendom, I'm talking about sort of this institutional state-sponsored Christianity. It actually often obliterates Christianity itself, and we can get to that. We can get to that. It's fascinating if you look at, and we can put this in the show notes, but Pew Research Center surveyed not just all 50 American states for their religiosity, but also all of Europe, and found that Russia is one of the least religious states in Europe, and Ukraine is one of the more religious states in Europe. In fact, about twice as many people in the Ukraine are serious about their religion compared to Russia, which is a very fascinating aspect of this. So there's the military assault, but then there's also an intellectual assault. And the intellectual assault we've talked a little bit about before, but it kind of goes along these lines. It says that there is something inherent about liberal democracy that degrades morality and religion. In other words, that there's a fine line between liberalism, again, we're not talking about in the political sense, we're talking about the systemic sense, but there's a fine line between liberalism and libertinism, and that liberalism, with its emphasis on individual rights, eats away at the formative institutions that create character and that sort of create community solidarity and create a sense of belonging to something larger than yourself. And so a critic of liberalism looks at, for example, perceptions that they have that America is becoming a more immoral and less religious nation, and says that's liberalism at work. And so therefore what we have to do is we have to assume more state power and direct that state power towards what, if you want to call it the common good, that's a phrase that's often used, but direct it towards virtuous and even sometimes explicitly religious ends, often at the expense of individual liberty, you're going to arrest the degradation of the culture. Do you think that's a fair assessment,
I
Curtis?
think that's the highbrow version you just articulated of the internal domestic assault on democracy. There is a much more threatening and present and scary lowbrow version of it, which is really what we saw on January 6th, which is what we saw was those highbrow arguments boiled down into a very mass sentiment that
turned
we
into
have
a
to
riot.
take. It turned into a riot, turned into an insurrection that said we have to take America and its institutions, including the Congress, the Capitol, literally take it over. We have to literally invade it with violence and force and take it over because somehow we're going to wrest it back to Christianity, right? And this is, you've written about this. We've seen many articles about this, that you can't understand January 6th unless you understand the presence of a very conservative, militaristic form of, at least ostensible Christianity that was bearing signs that said Jesus saves as it was scaling the walls of the Capitol.
Right. Well, I like to steel man the opposition, Curtis.
Okay, very good.
Yeah. Well, you have an interesting point that you raise, and this is something that I think is really important to understand when we're talking about this system that we have and why we have it. And you use a phrase that goes something like this, that Christianity was the parent of liberal democracy, in part because democracy was solving a Christian problem.
Yeah. Can I expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I really do think the analogy of a parent and a prodigal son is a good analogy, historical analogy for the relationship between Christianity as the parent and liberal democracy as the prodigal son. Because Christianity really historically is the parent of liberal democracy in the sense that it originated from Christians trying to solve a problem found, frankly, in Christendom, right?
Yeah.
It was trying to solve a problem. Liberal democracy was trying to solve a problem. And also in the sense that the solution was proposed by Christians and it drew on Christian truths. It grew on biblical truths. So both as a problem, liberal democracy understood as a problem and a solution, really you have to understand the Christian parentage. And so let me break that down. So the problem was that Christians, it turns out, not surprisingly, are fallen human beings, just like everyone else.
Yeah.
And one of the primary ways that sin, the fall, expresses itself is in this fundamental desire to get our own way. You can sort of boil down kind of an impulse of sin is, I want to have my own way. And Christians are fallen beings just like everyone else. And so we found Christians insisting that we have to get our own way in the religious wars of the 15th and 16th centuries, where you had Catholics and Protestants killing each other over their differences because each side wanted to get its own way, so much so that they will kill the other person who is standing in their way, right? And so this was the problem that
i.e. Russia right now.
Well, now exactly, and that's the modern version of this is Russia.
Yeah. We're watching it happen right here.
We're watching this
now.
happen right before our eyes, and so this is a replay of that same historical impulse that Christianity, Christendom, in Europe was wrestling with in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. And so Christian thinkers in the Enlightenment were saying, this is not right. This is not good. This does not reflect God and the glory. This does not bring glory to God. And so you had foundational thinkers that originated all of the key principles of liberal democracy. People like John Locke, Hugo Grotius, and we can go on. They were all deeply Christian thinkers, motivated to try to solve this problem of Christian on Christian violence, okay? And that's, in trying to solve that problem, that's how they worked their way to the principles of liberal democracy, to establish a way of doing politics, a way of governing ourselves that doesn't involve killing each other, or at least oppressing each other, just to get our own way. So that's the problem. Now, the solution that folks like Locke and Grotius worked on is because they were deeply Christian, they drew upon their Christian story. They drew upon their biblical resources to say, well, how do we solve this problem then? And that's where they really landed on that foundational truth found from Genesis 1 that's embedded in Judaism and Christianity in the Judeo-Christian narrative that humans are image bearers of God. Humans bear the image of God. And that's really a liberal democracy in its origin rests on the notion that human individuals have an inherent dignity and worth. And so you ask, well, why do humans have dignity and worth? For centuries, the notion that an individual human had worth and dignity was actually not accepted. It was slaves. Humans were treated as objects if you didn't fall upon within a sort of a privileged class. So this widespread notion that all humans are endowed with dignity and worth, are bear the image of God, that as the Declaration of Independence, that they are endowed with certain inalienable rights. That draws from this biblical narrative, starting from the very beginning of the biblical story, that we were made in the image of God. And the Judeo-Christian story is what's supplied that story, that supplied that answer to, well, why do human beings matter? Well, they matter, and they should therefore have dignity, and that dignity should be guarded by rights. And those rights should be guarded by a form of governance, right? So that whole string of thought that leads to liberal democracy, it finds its origins, its spiritual DNA in Christianity. And I would say that notion of the human as having inherent dignity and worth, such that it should be protected by rights and then the government that protects those rights, that whole narrative, that is one of the signal contributions that Christianity has made to the world, culturally speaking.
Yeah. I love,
So-
there's a,
Go ahead.
let me just read a quick paragraph that I think really says this well. And it doesn't, so far as I know, the author of this paragraph is not a Christian. He's not coming at it from a Christian perspective, but he's talking about the results of liberalism, of liberal democracy, as in exactly these terms. And this is the paragraph. It's from a guy who wrote under the pseudonym Scott Alexander. People talk about liberalism as if it's just another word for capitalism or libertarianism or vague center-left democratic Clintonism. Liberalism is none of these things. Liberalism is a technology for preventing civil war. It was forged in the fires of hell, the horrors of the endless 17th century religious wars. For 100 years, Europe tore itself apart in some of the most brutal ways imaginable, until finally, from the burning wreckage, we drew forth this amazing piece of alien machinery, a machine that when tuned just right, let people live together peacefully without doing the kill people for being Protestant thing. Popular historical strategies for dealing with differences have included brutally enforced conformity, brutally efficient genocide, and making sure to keep this alien machine tuned really, really carefully. I love the way that's put.
I do, with one exception. I don't like the machinery metaphor that he's using, because I think it's actually more of an organic relationship than that. That I do think that's why I like the analogy of liberal democracy as the child, as the intellectual and spiritual child of democracy, because it's a living, breathing thing. It's not a piece of technology that just is in place and will be running forever. It's an organic relationship, and that relationship can change, and it has changed. And that's actually where the critique of democracy, I think you have to understand, it's ultimately an account of how the relationship went bad, just like in the story of the prodigal son. And that story, my telling the story would go something like this. So after Christians parented and brought forth democracy into the world, democracy grew strong. It grew up. It spread throughout the world. But like that prodigal son, it increasingly severed itself from the parent. It wanted it to have its own life. It wanted to have its own independence. And so it still wanted to hold on to the notion of the human as having dignity and worth. So it still wanted the notion of human rights, for instance, but it was like, turn that inheritance over to me and let me go my own way, away from the ongoing relationship, spiritual relationship with Christianity. And so as liberal democracy became more purely secular and insistently secular, it left behind the religious story, the religious parentage, if you will, that undergirded, that narrated, that gave meaning to those rights. And over the centuries, liberal Western democracy, in its secular form, has been what I would call living off of this original spiritual inheritance and spending it down. And spending it down and down such that it gets more and more separated from that original story, the spiritual narrative. And so it's now waking up in a distant land saying, okay, gosh, where am I now? How do I intellectually, spiritually fund this view of humanity? And there is a sense in which, I would say, especially up until the Ukraine war, the invasion of Ukraine, that liberal democracy was on the defensive. There was a sense of intellectual and spiritual exhaustion. You know, the Freedom House, which is a nonprofit that tracks kind of the strength of democracy over the world, you know, just this last year published a report that said democracy under siege. And it showed that worldwide, by its metrics of strength of democracy, it's been declining for the last 16 years straight, right?
Yeah.
And the reason, I think, is because ultimately there's a spiritual, it's experiencing that spending down of its spiritual inheritance. And you know when a movement is exhausted or has lost its vitality is when it cannot answer in a very robust way the question, why? Like if somebody challenges that movement and says, well, why? Like, and doesn't take it for granted, if that movement doesn't have a really robust answer, that's when you know something's gone off from its origins, right? And that's what's happened when Russia, when China has trampled over human rights domestically in its own country, or when Russia, invades another country. It's basically saying to the West and Western democracies, why? Why should we respect individual rights? Why should we care about another country's sovereignty and autonomy? And you get this sense that the West has been like, kind of like, I don't, it's lacking a robust, confident answer to why, because it's gotten severed from that story. It's in a faraway land, to use the metaphor of the prodigal son, and it's distant from God. And so it has no higher story to tell of why individuals ought to have this dignity and worth, and therefore it's collapsed into that critique that you read from Deneen, which is true, which is that if liberal democracies no longer view humans as an image of God, then it's just if you take the God part out of it, then you're just viewing individuals as just the image, and actually ultimately as God, right? Then without humans as the image of God, humans ultimately become just God itself. And so that's the critique, valid, I think, of modern secular liberal democracies, that it has exalted individuals not from the image of God as reflecting characteristics of God, but actually as God itself, and such that whatever the individual wants, the individual should get. And that's where you get from liberty to libertinism, and where you get this sort of atomized, autonomous story of the individual that ultimately is a lonely story that is part of the spiritual weakness, I think, in Western liberal secular societies. So that's a mouthful, but what do you think of that?
No, I think that's right. And I think that what you're talking about, if you're thinking through, for example, the American founding, the system of government that we created was never intended to be the ultimate source of meaning, purpose, and virtue in our society. It was never intended to be that. It was intended to provide space for and room for those institutions that would provide for those really, truly existential needs. And so I like to think of the principles of the founding as creating a kind of social compact between citizen and state. And the short way of understanding that social compact is found in two seminal documents. One of the most famous human-created documents in the world, the Declaration of Independence. Another one in one of the less famous but very, very important documents, John Adams' letter to the Massachusetts militia of October 11th, 1798. It's a pretty short little letter, but here's document one, of course, says, we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then what Jefferson says is interesting in the very next part of the Declaration. He talks about how governments were instituted among men for the purpose of preserving these rights. So this is sort of a classic formulation of small L liberalism. One of government's core functions, it's not its only function, but one of its core functions is protecting your individual liberty as an expression of your dignity as a child of God. Okay, so that's an absolute core function of government. But what John Adams says is, okay, wait a minute. Now, possessing this liberty, we have an enormous responsibility. And he says it to the Massachusetts militia. And by the way, having served in the reserves, I can tell you we typically wouldn't get letters from politicians of this sophistication. So
you weren't getting John Adams quality missives when you were training?
We're not getting John Adams quality ethical training. So he says this: because we have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion, avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. And then here's the famous line: our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. This is that first sentence: because we have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion, avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through our net. Explains two things at once, Curtis. It explains two things at once. One thing it explains is the absolute necessity in a liberal democracy of citizens. There's citizen responsibility for the system to work.
That's right.
There's citizen responsibility. This is the heart of ordered liberty, is this notion that that we are free, and we are free to do what? We're not freed to just do whatever we want. Although we have the liberty we have the liberty to abuse our liberty, right?
Right.
But the purpose of our liberty, the fundamental purpose of our liberty, is not for individual fulfillment.
Yeah.
The fundamental purpose of our liberty is we are free to do good.
Yeah.
It's one way of saying it. And so if you begin to, so that the number one, that explains sort of how the system is supposed to work. But then number two, it explains also the temptation, why there is a temptation to break liberal democracy. And it's in this: because we have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions, there's a tendency to say, well, what if we did have a government armed with the power that's capable of contending with human passions? Then we don't have to rely so completely on all of these human choices. And that has been a very compelling temptation for people, for Christian people, for centuries and centuries, is, wait a minute, I'm not going to, we can't trust the people with this liberty.
Yeah.
We have to arm the government with the power, which then brings us to the second part of classical liberalism. You were talking about classical liberalism. Liberal democracy recognizes the dignity of man. It also recognizes the fallenness of man, including of leaders. Including of leaders, because this is where that temptation to move towards power, where it doesn't just, it falls because it doesn't respect the dignity of man, but it also falls because it doesn't respect the fallenness of man, including these leaders who try to possess and wield power for the good. There's a long record of trying that.
Yeah.
There's a long record of trying
it's
that.
Ugly. It's an ugly record.
Ugly record.
Yeah, I really love that. I think, again, this whole idea of this very intricate, delicate relationship between Christianity or religion and a democracy, it's really important to articulate well. I think it's critical what you just said, to reiterate that a democracy cannot provide the moral meaning and purpose for the freedom it grants, right? There needs to be something else that comes to give that higher power, and Christianity is one version of that. It doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't be the only one, but it should be one of the options, right? And this was Tocqueville's sort of assessment from his seminal analysis of American democracy. That, look, this is great, but this only works if you've got a religious view that gives citizens a reason to be together and to pursue ends. And that notion of freedom is deeply biblical, right? The deeply biblical notion of freedom is we're not free, exactly like you just said. We're not free to do whatever we want. That's not the purpose of the human freedom that God gives us. We're given freedom to be our true best selves. We're freed in the way that a bird is free to fly, to be what a bird does is to fly, not to swim. That's not what freedom of a bird is not to do whatever it wants to do. It's to be its true and best self. And that's really the relationship, is that Christianity is at least a option to say, this is your best self. This is how you use your freedom, human beings, that this freedom that liberal democracy grants you. So I think that's important. And that's actually why I really prefer this sort of parent-child metaphor for the relationship between Christianity and democracy, because that temptation that you describe of saying, well, why don't we just take the powers of government to enforce virtue, right, to compel virtue? Well, David, you're a parent of an adult child, 2 adult children. How well does that work? Right? How well does it work for us to mandate virtue and to actually enforce virtue? It doesn't, right? We can offer it, we can recommend it, we can model it, especially. But the moment we try to compel it, the moment we try to lock it down and say, you have to be virtuous in the way I define virtue, not only does it cause all sorts of rejection on their end, but it also actually expresses, to your point, all sorts of fallenness on our end, where our definition of virtue turns out to be, well, that was actually more just self-centered desire on the parents' part, right? And that's the danger for when Christians try to assume parenting, not as parenting an adult child, but really as an autocratic despot that's going to demand that they have their way.
Have I ever shared with you my escalating humility theory of parenting?
No, but I can't wait.
You can't. No, you can't. You're waiting.
No. I'm not being facetious. I want to hear it.
Okay. So, and I don't know if this is your experience, but when you're parenting very young kids, infants, toddlers, parent talk was very interesting. And it was, here's what works. People would say, here's how you get your kid to sleep through the night.
Right.
Here's how you potty train your kids. Right. And you'd read these books like, this is the guide, this works. And there was often a lot of kind of, if your kid was sleeping through the night and then potty trained and then reading really early, you'd have a lot of parent pride. I've got this
because I've done it right.
I've done it right, And then what I began to notice is, as kids got older, a lot of that parent pride just started to fall to the wayside. When someone graduates from high school, now this is not universal, because there are people who their kids graduate from high school and they're getting into the college they want to get into, and they've got all the glittering college application, and they're like, we did this. But I get a lot more of parents when kids graduate and they're doing well and they're thriving, that's much more like, whew, then look what I did. And I think what happens is, as your kid grows up and becomes a more complicated individual, independent human being, you realize it's not like a formula. There's not a formula. And the extension here in the governmental realm is, when the more complicated your society,
right,
the less your ability to wield power for its good. And which is I think a fundamental failing is that we often think that if my faction or I could wield power over this complex society or complex groups of individuals, I could do it for the good. And what classical liberalism says, don't be so sure about yourself, and we're so not sure about you, we're never going to give you all the power you want to have.
So So let's take a step back. If we're sort of using, as I propose, this sort of metaphor of a parent-child relationship to characterize the relationship between Christianity and democracy, there's a sense in which both parties in this relationship have left each other over the years, right? There's a sense in which democracy has become increasingly secularized and is not only not wanting to remain connected to the Christian story, it almost at times can want to banish it entirely from the public view, like to get it out entirely in its worst forms, right? This is where we want to squash any expression of religion, a misinterpretation of the separation of church and state doctrine, as to say, let's squash Christianity or any religion from the public square entirely. So there's various ways in which I think you could say the child has left the parent in that regard. There's also a sense, though, that the parent has left the child, in the sense of the parent has forgotten about the child, that Christians have forgotten. They've almost become like this senile, dementia-induced parent that's like, wait, we have a child, and don't recognize their parental responsibility for democracy, a responsibility that is not domination or control, but is really this cultivation and influence and nurture, right? And I would say, if you want to extend the metaphor even further, it seems to me Christians have forgotten their parental responsibilities for democracy in two ways. So maybe on the more like center progressive side, they're like benignly they suffer from the benign form of dementia, in that like they just sort of assume that there's a democracy out there, but like, wait, are we related to this? Are we related to this thing? Are we related to this? Such that I think if you asked, 100 pastors, right, who are even, say, sort of moderate to progressive pastors, if you ask 100 progressive pastors, make the case for why Christians should care about democracy, I think you'd have an incredibly low batting average of pastors who would feel confident to articulate the relationship between Christianity and democracy. I mean, speaking as a former pastor, I'm going to bet out of 100, like less than 5 would be able to feel confident to get up there and give even a mini sermon on the relationship between Christianity and democracy, right? So there's a way in which we've just forgotten kind of the origins, right? That were related to this being called democracy. And then I would say the conservative end, the Christians are resembling like the angry sufferer of dementia, right? The one who's like just hostile and violent and aggressive. It's like, who's that child? Maybe not that. That's not my child. They're like, why is that person in my house? And looking at suspiciously upon this child of democracy. And at the grassroots level, we see that, of course, on January 6th. But like you said, at the intellectual level, we're seeing that, the movement of Catholic integralism, which is this idea that really trying to almost recapture this dominating Christendom view that again, I think is a distortion of this original relationship. So it seems to me we're at this key pivotal moment, David, that we need to restore this relation. We need to effect a reconciliation between parent and child. And maybe it starts by stating very clearly, look, here's why you each need each other. Here's why we've already articulated the story. You actually are related historically, but we almost need to refresh the relationship by saying, and here's why even today, why you two need each other. And maybe David you could start if you just explain, especially because of your expertise in the realm of religious liberty, why do Christians need liberal democracy? Like, not need in an absolute sense, like dependent on it, but why do Christians benefit from liberal democracy in a way that they should have a stake in the thriving of liberal democracy?
Yeah, well,
today.
One of the most interesting aspects of American democracy is that if America is both one of the oldest continually existing democracies in the world, which is, we think of ourselves as a young country, but really we're getting a little grayer with each year that goes by. We're getting a little grayer, and we're also getting grayer in a pretty specific way. And we're getting grayer in that we're one of the oldest small L liberal democracies that exists on the planet. We're also one of the most religious societies. We're also one of the most religious societies, and we're certainly probably, that's kind of contradictory. We are one of the most religious of the advanced, advanced economies in the world. And I don't think that these two things are coincidental. And why is that? I think because what's happened is that our liberal society has given religion, an American religion, space to be itself. And it has given I'm going to read. At its
best, it's done that. Yeah.
At its best, it's done that. And at its best, American Christianity can be wonderful. At its best, when both sides, the government and the church, fulfill their part of the social compact, can be remarkable and wonderful, and by human standards, just something to behold. And you said something. You mentioned de Tocqueville. It's my job on this podcast to read paragraphs, so I'm going to read a paragraph of de Tocqueville, and I think this gets at what has worked, and it also gets at what needs repair. Okay. Yeah. And here's de Tocqueville. Americans of all ages, all conditions, all minds constantly unite. Not only do they have commercial and industrial associations in which all take part, but they also have 1,000 other kinds: religious, moral, grave, futile, very general and very particular, immense and very small. Americans use associations to give fetes, to found seminaries, to build inns, to raise churches, to distribute books, to send missionaries. In this manner, they create hospitals, prisons, schools. Finally, if it is a question of bringing to light a truth or developing a sentiment with the support of a great example, they associate. Everywhere that at the head of a new undertaking, you see the government in France and a great lord in England, count on it that you will perceive an association in the United States. And when I think of what we do at our best, notes what's happening here. The government has given the space to human beings to exercise virtuous industry. And when I think of how do we reform our culture, I'm thinking the government is still pretty good at granting us liberty. But what we've been decaying at is that de Tocquevillian community bond or associational bond. And this gets to a lot of your talk, Curtis, about institutions. What has been decaying is our commitment to these institutions. One of the most powerful and prescient books of the modern era is Putnam's Bowling Alone. Yeah. You know, if you read that through the eyes of our culture really only works when we form together and gain our purpose, our transcendent purpose, outside of the government. And then when you see Bowling Alone and you realize, wait a minute, we're beginning to lose that core purpose. One of the most vital reforms that we can undertake isn't a government reform at all. It's reforming our own communities. It's reforming our own associations. Or if we're not even a part of a community, a local community or a local association, joining and being a part of one.
David, you're singing my tune. Institutions matter. They matter to Christians because they bear the image of God. That is how we image God. It's part of that humans as having an inherent dignity, worth that reflects something of God. And I think this understanding is so crucial because, like you said, it's Christians lending value, purpose, and meaning to society through forming organizations and institutions. That's what helps democracy achieve its best. And it's also, we need to give Christians also a narrative for why they also ought to support democratic institutions, right? In this moment, when they are being threatened and they are being assaulted, I think Christians can respond, one, in the way you just described, by strengthening civil society in the form of the organizations that we form and sustain and nurture, but also rallying to the defense of the democratic institutions themselves, right? Free and fair elections, a free press, a judiciary that acts responsibly and transparently. Like, we as Christian citizens should be calling forth, supporting, critiquing when those democratic institutions aren't acting at their best, or defending them when they are being under assault. And all of that, I do think, is why we do need to reground Christians to care about institutions, because institutions are the thing that gives life to democracy, and democracy itself is a set of institutions, right? And so I'm going to just, once again, I'm going to really remind our listeners, again, for the biblical case for why Christians ought to actually treasure and defend and support institutions as image-bearing beings. And again, I'm just going to go back to Colossians 1:15 and 18, which says the Son is the image of the invisible God, right? So the Son of God, which is the truly human one, the human expression of God, images God, is the perfect image of God. Well, what image is the Son? What image is Jesus? Well, the verse goes on to say, for things image him, things that are created, things in heaven and earth, visible and invisible. Well, what kind of things are we talking about that image God? It turns out, he says, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. So which things image the Jesus as the Son of God? It turns out institutions, powers, rulers, and authorities image God. And so that's why Christians ought to care, because these institutions are human expressions of how humans bear the image of God. And the thing emphasizes an image is not the thing itself, right? A painting of the Mona Lisa is not Mona Lisa, right? So when we say institutions, an organization or a government institution, when we say that they image God, we're not saying they are God, and we're not saying they have to be Christian explicitly. They can still be secular in nature. An image doesn't have to be completely conflated with the thing it's imaging. What an image does is it reflects key characteristics of that person being imaged. So like the Mona Lisa painting images the mysteriousness, the enigmatic nature of the person, the real person, Mona Lisa, but it is not Mona Lisa, itself, right? So in the same way, Christians should think about institutions as reflecting certain characteristics of God. So for example, a hospital, right? A hospital is an institution that, by the way, was invented by Christians. Christians invented hospitals. They created those into being. Why? Because they wanted to image a certain characteristic of God. God as healer, God as carer of the sick, right? So that's a way which hospitals, which are now mostly secular in nature, still nevertheless bear the image of God, because they still bear this characteristic of God as healer, right? So that's how we ought to think about institutions, as image-bearing beings that image certain characteristics of God. And it's helpful for us to actually articulate more precisely what characteristics are being imaged by particular institutions. And so when we talk about Christians as wanting to support democratic institutions, David, I want you to explain, how is it that democratic institutions image certain characteristics of God? Which characteristics in particular? And I'm going to direct you to your favorite triad that you've spoken so eloquently on. Help us through your favorite triad of godly virtues, of God-imaging virtues. How does democracy image Micah 6:8? Do your Micah 6:8 riff for us.
Yeah, so Micah 6:8, for those who don't remember, it's, what does the Lord require of you, O man? What is good? It's to act justly, to love mercy or love kindness, depending on the translation, and to walk humbly before the Lord your God. And the thing that I find fascinating about, first, is an individual obligation. Boy, that is a complex interplay of three virtues of humility, justice, and mercy. That tempers at each phase. It tempers our worst instincts, right? So if you're inclined towards all justice, you're often lacking both humility and kindness, right? Sometimes you can be humble and kind and so conflict averse that you neglect justice. It makes nothing about this is comfortable for us, because it's always going to press us somewhere, right?
Right.
And also, I think this is how classical liberal structures are pressed through and at their best can model this. So one of the things that classical liberal structures do is they build in humility. And how do they build in humility? They build in humility in some interesting ways. One is due process. Okay, due process is built in humility. We are very bad at discovering the truth.
Yeah,
and so
that's a great point.
What we have to do in a complex situation is implement processes, rules of evidence, etc., that control for, as much as we can, sort of our fallen human nature and our biases, and try to get us to be able to discover what truth is. Here's another one that controls for humility: free speech. Free speech is and free exercise of religion. They both are a declaration that no given faction or individual is the possessor of all truth.
Yeah.
They require us to be open to opposing ideas. They require us. How does the classical liberal structure build in mercy? Well, there's a very specific provision of the Constitution, of the Bill of Rights, the ban on cruel and unusual punishment. We take that for granted in this country. We take that for granted. That's a world historic development.
Yeah, absolutely.
A ban on cruel and unusual punishment was a world historic development.
Well, as evidenced by our Easter celebration, which is really marking a widespread use of a very cruel and unusual punishment. Yeah.
And these are just individual examples. It's not the comprehensive. And then the last thing is act justly. Well, there are elements of just pure justice that exist within the classical liberal structure when you're talking about, for example, going back to due process, you just can't have justice without due process. Right. You just try it. You can't do it. You cannot have, you're never going to have perfect justice on this earth, but you can't even get close without due process. And then the fundamental recognition of the dignity of man and the equality that all men are created equal, and that equality is a core idea, as a core concept within biblical justice. And then also the way in which the system is oriented towards questioning autocratic power and denying autocratic power is itself an instrument of justice. I go back to Frederick Douglass's his plea for free speech in Boston that he issued in 1860 after an abolitionist event was shut down by a mob, and the police did nothing to stop the mob and everything to stop the event. And he issued a plea for free speech in Boston, and he said that free speech was the great moral and cultural renovator of society. And so you're talking about free speech as an instrument of justice. And so this is when the system is working the way it should. It deals with and grapples with these three interlocking obligations, I think, in a way that is very powerful. But of course, it's part of the social compact. It requires us to participate in those institutions and manifest those same virtues.
David, that's brilliant. I love this idea. Like, look, we worship a God that is merciful, humble, and just. So if we want to image that God, which is merciful, humble, and just, we want ruling, governing, democratic institutions that reflect that. And you just made a case for why democratic institutions, at their best, when participated in by citizens, really do image mercy and humility and justice in a way that I struggle to find any other form of governance that comes close to imaging those characteristics as well as democracy does. So I love that, mercy, humility, justice. But, David, I'm going to see your mercy, humility, justice, and I'm going to raise you. Okay? I'm going to raise you because I'm going to talk about the more excellent way, an even more excellent way. So as much as I love mercy, humility, justice, I want to talk about the characteristic of God that is love. Right? 1 John 4 says, God is love. Love is central, the central defining characteristic of who God is. And so that underlines, by the way, why we can't image God alone as individuals, because you can't love alone, right? You need others to love. And this is why an isolated individual, by definition, is an incomplete image of God. You need others. You need that association that Tocqueville talks about, and you need organizations and institutions that bring you together with other people. This is why institutions image God, because God is love, and you need others to love, and so therefore you need organizations, institutions to bring you together to image that love. So how do human collectives image the love of God? Well, let's go to that more excellent way. And that phrase is from 1 Corinthians 13, when Paul says, hey, you can have all these great virtues, knowledge, truth, whatever, but without love, you're like an empty gong, right? Like the more excellent way is love. And in that description in 1 Corinthians 13, there's a list of descriptions of love that's often read at weddings and so forth, but it's really quite profound. And I'll pick out just one descriptor of love from 1 Corinthians 13, verse 5. And it's this beautiful phrase that says, love is not self-seeking. Love is not self-seeking. Or in other translations says, love does not insist on its own way. So remember what we all talked about, that fundamental human drive to say, I want to have things my way. What 1 Corinthians is saying is, love is not doing that. Love is not seeking your own way. And that, by the way, is a central characteristic of God. We worship a God that does not insist on his own way. We see that in the Easter story itself, right? Yesterday was Maundy Thursday, which celebrates Gethsemane, where Jesus, the Son, says to the Father, yet not my will, but yours. Not my will, but yours. God, at God's very internal central being, in the very relationship between Father and Son, is this not self-seeking, not insisting on its own way characteristic. That is love. And, that's crucial to love. Think of the other collective bodies you're a part of, your marriage or your family. Imagine if in a marriage, one party always had his or her own way. Right? Or in a family, if one child always had his or her own way, or the parent always had his or her own way, that marriage or family would rapidly shrivel, and love would be drained from that set of relationships, right? And so this is crucial to love. That is not getting your own way. It's making room for others, for difference, for other desires. And here's I believe is the unassailable truth. Democracy, democratic institutions, image this love better than any other form of government ever invented. Because this is the point you've just basically made in your own way, core to democracy is that no one gets their own way all the time. Right? Democracy is built in checks and balances, respect for law, change of government through elections, an executive branch that is held accountable. No one gets their own way. And that's part of the frustrating thing of democracy, right? Is that for those who just have this impulse to always get their own way, it's like, no, you don't always get it. Even when your way might be right in the abstract, even when, abortion is wrong, you don't always get your own way, even when your way is theoretically right. And that's actually the beauty of democracy. That is how democracy images God, the love of God that is not self-seeking, not always insisting on its own way. And this is precisely why Christians should defend and repair and participate in our democratic institutions, even when we're not getting our own way. Because precisely when we participate and defend and support democracy and elections that don't end up with the result we want, that's when we precisely image God, the God of love that is not self-seeking.
It's interesting. We started by talking about why would we talk about this now with the military, why would we talk about this now? And we talked about the military threat abroad and the intellectual or political threat here at home. And what is fascinating to me is that at the same time that we're seeing this, and I want to stay abroad for a minute, at the same time that we're seeing this incredible threat of militarized Christendom arise again and assaulting a nation that aspires to liberal democracy, we're also seeing in many ways the best at the same time as this great evil has arisen. We're seeing the best of what the church how the church can respond, and also the best of how liberal democracies can respond. And I've written about this before, but I think it's really important as we're talking about sort of these challenges, especially from Christendom or from Christians to liberal democracy. I think it's important to note the virtues that are arising in response. First, this kind of really incredible defense that we're seeing of, this incredible act of defiance and self-defense from the Ukrainians is really sort of echo, and it's not as if Ukraine is trying to take Russia and Russia is trying to take Ukraine. This is complete self-defense, and it reminds me of C.S. Lewis when he's talking about virtuous patriotism in his book The Four Loves. He says patriotism of this kind, which is rooted in this love of home, of the place you grow up in or the places you've grown up in. He says this kind of patriotism is not in the least aggressive. It asks only to be let alone. It becomes militant only to protect what it loves. And that just really strikes me as what's happening right now in the defense of liberal democracy overseas. And then the other thing that we're seeing is the power in the United States of these independent and free associations to immediately respond out of love towards the people of Ukraine. And it's been so moving to me because down here, there's an awful lot of churches who have sent missionaries to Ukraine over the years. And churches around here are mobilizing and mobilized instantly to head to Ukraine. And there's Samaritan's Purse field hospitals and outside of Lviv. There are small Baptist churches in Alabama who sent their whole pastoral team to Moldova to try to receive refugees and help. That's the kind of thing when we're talking about these associations and the power of the church and a liberal democracy to have the liberty to manifest these virtues. Yeah. That's exactly what we're talking about, and we're seeing it. And sometimes it takes seeing the extremes, the extreme evil of an invasion, the extreme good of the humanitarian response, to really understand the underlying principles. And I think that's playing out in front of us right now.
Well, and that's maybe a good segue to the task for Christians in these next few years domestically, because I think it is inspiring to see that Christians are rallying to defend democracy abroad. But as we've been saying all along, there is very obvious, very clear signs of a growing assault internally on democracy in the United States, and that Christians need to be on the front lines and on there, and not in a militaristic sense, but in a intellectual, cultural, organizing sense, to support and defend democracy. I think especially 2024, as we head into the election, all the signs are this is going to be even more polarizing, even more a sense of anxiety that will impel people into a sense of extreme panic that may cause them to want to seize power or to just insist on having its own way, even if they've lost an election, right? Even worse repeat of January 6th is really possible in 2024. And so, David, you and I are trying to do our little part on this. Why don't you talk a little bit about and share with us just some of our initial thoughts and desires on how we can play our role and how we want to invite others to be part of that.
Yeah. So, I'm glad you brought up 2024. I've been out and speaking a lot lately, and because of the topic of my recent book being the possibility that America might separate, folks have asked me after 2020, after January 6th, as polarization just keeps increasing, what am I thinking? And one of the things I say is, for the very first time in my life, I'm walking into a presidential election season where I'm 99% sure our country will survive. But I'm not 100% sure. I'm not 100% sure our country will survive another election cycle, which I can't believe those words are coming out of my mouth. But again, I'm 99% sure. And it's not because, the Democrats will destroy us or because the Republicans will destroy us. It's because we'll destroy it.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
and so one of the things that I think is really important, and one of the things that we're wanting to focus on, is we're creating what we're going to call a post-partisan Christian project. Okay, post-partisan Christian project, which essentially says that the path forward to fulfill that mission that we have of Micah 6:8, of acting justly, loving mercy, and walking humbly, is not going to come through partisan identities. That's not to say that you don't vote for a Republican or a Democrat. It's not to even say you don't run for office as a Republican or a Democrat. It's to recenter the fundamental identity of Christians in this American classical liberal American democracy as Christians and not as Republicans or Democrats. And so there's going to be more to come on that. But it's what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to create a program, a post-partisan Christian program that is going to really invest in what does it mean to spiritually form people as Christians participating in this democracy, not as Republican Christians or Democratic Christians, but as Christians participating in this democracy. And Curtis, at Redeeming Babel, you're hiring, right?
Yeah, we're hiring with an eye to especially towards this post-partisan Christian project, realizing we need to build this out, and we're announcing our first hire, perhaps first of several, but first hire of somebody who's going to really help us drive this project, and especially drive partnerships around this, because we can't do this alone. We don't want this to be our thing. We want this to be a broad partnership among many organizations, many people, many leaders at the grassroots that can rally around this post-partisan Christian message. And if you're listening to anything that we've just said and something stirs in you like, oh, I want to be part of that, I want to give myself to that even for the next few years, I think especially if you're in your 20s, 30s or something like that, but maybe not even just that, but looking for a cause that you want to give yourself to for a while. We are hiring. I encourage you to go to redeemingbabel.org, where we've posted this first of what we hope will be others of job description that will involve working with me and David on this post-partisan Christian project, along with other projects we're doing. So please check it out. If anything we're saying, you have a whisper of a sense of calling in it, at least check it out and see if this role might be something that might be a good next step of God's calling on your life. So again, that'll be found on redeemingbabel.org, and we look forward to hearing from folks.
All right. Well, that's been a slightly longer podcast than normal. But thanks for hanging in there. And this was, we got into the intellectual and philosophical weeds here, which is kind of fun.
We went from your escalated theory of humility, parental humility, to Tocqueville. So that's, yes, between those two things, that's a lot of ground.
That's a lot of ground. Well, we hope, listeners, that you enjoy a blessed Easter weekend. And we are, okay, time out. I never can transition to the end very well. All right. We hope, listeners, you enjoy a blessed Easter weekend. And thank you, as always, for listening. Please check out, as Curtis said, the job opening at redeemingbabel.org. Also, check out thedispatch.com, where my newsletter is located, The French Press. And again, appreciate you listening. Happy Easter, and we will talk to you next Saturday.